The Battle of Issus is one of the greatest battles in history. The Battle of Issus was the first major battle in which Alexander the Great, who wanted to put an end to the Persians, faced the Persian king Darius. How did a 40,000-strong Macedonian army fight against a 100,000-strong Persian army? What happened when Alexander the Great and Darius locked eyes? How did the battle end, and how many men did both armies lose? How did Alexander treat Darius's family when he captured them? How did he later carry out his conquests in the Levant? And what happened at the siege of Tyre, one of the most extraordinary sieges in history? The answers to all these questions are now in Part 2 of our History of Wars documentary series. In the summer of 334 BC, about a year before the Battle of Issus, Alexander the Great inflicted the first defeat on the Persians at the Battle of Granicus and conquered Anatolia. Besieging port cities such as Ephesus, Sardis, Miletus, and Halicarnassus, he advanced as far as Side in the Mediterranean and met with his generals in Gordion to start preparations for the Battle of Issus. With preparations finally completed, Alexander set off again from Gordion for his campaigns in the east. He decided to follow the king's route and descend to the Mediterranean Sea. He crossed the Tarsus Mountains and reached Cilicia. The Persians aimed to burn the harvest there and prevent the Macedonians from taking advantage of it. However, Alexander moved so fast that he did not allow the Persians to burn the harvest here. Alexander's first target after crossing the Cilician gates was now Tarsus, the capital of Cilicia. Contrary to expectations, Alexander refused to take the main road and arrived in Tarsus via a shorter but very rough road. Once again, the Persians were late in burning the granaries and razing the city to the ground. Alexander's swift arrival by a shortcut ensured that Tarsus was taken without being destroyed and its granaries burned. While this was happening in the west, in the east, in Babylon, Darius began to gather a large army. This time, Darius, king of Persia, was to lead the army himself. He described himself as a good cavalryman, a good shooter, and a good archer. The Persian army was made up of volunteers and mercenaries from many other nations besides Persia, such as the Medes, Elamites, Parthians, Babylonians, Armenians, Cappadocians, and even Greeks. Each of them was equipped with all kinds of rich armor. Every weapon was available from swords, pikes, axes, spears, bows, and arrows to chariots. In total, it is estimated that an army of 100,000 men was assembled. The reason why Darius assembled such a large army was to defeat Alexander in a single great battle, and then turn west again to reclaim all the lands he had lost. It was the last days of October in 333 BC. Alexander's headquarters were in Tarsus. He had sent his general Parmenion to the opposite coast to Alexandretta, which he would later name after himself, and stationed him west of the Belen Pass. Darius and his army were at the other end of the Belen Pass, east of the Amanus Mountains. The Persians expected the Macedonians to come through the Belen Pass, while the Macedonians, on the contrary, wanted the Persians to come through. Both sides were adopting a defensive strategy, and patience was wearing thin. Alexander could take no more and decided to join Parmenion and set off from Tarsus, heading south with his army. Darius must have learned that Alexander was not behind the pass and that he had only just set out, so he decided to pursue a different strategy, and he too set off. Darius began to march northward and came to the northern end of the Amanus Mountains. His goal here was to meet Alexander on his way from Tarsus without joining Parmenion, and to defeat Alexander by fighting against a smaller army. However, one of the most interesting events in the history of warfare took place. Alexander had already marched south along the coastline and joined Parmenion before Darius had even reached the northern tip. By the time Darius was aware of this, it was too late. He decided to move again, heading southwest to the port city of Issus. Alexander had left all his sick and wounded soldiers in the city of Issus when he passed through the city because he thought he would fight Darius at the Belen Pass. Darius captured the city and put all these soldiers to the sword. Alexander was also unaware that Darius was heading north. When he learned that he had entered Issus, he was surprised and headed north again and spent the night near the Pillar of Jonah. The next day, Alexander and his army set out before dawn and marched towards Issus. Marching along the seashore, the army passed through a very narrow area but quickly reached the city. The Persians did not expect them to arrive so quickly and were again caught unprepared. Darius had also hoped to fight on a wide field, relying on his large cavalry. But now he would have to fight on the seashore, on rough terrain with little room for maneuver, and he would not get the efficiency he wanted from his cavalry. For this reason, he set up a defense line of infantry, mercenaries, and archers behind the Pius River, 17 kilometers south of Issus. He kept the cavalry close to the seashore, where they could attack the enemy from the rear. Alexander moved his troops in an orderly fashion from the narrow passage of the coastline to the wide plain and began to line up his army towards the Pius River. He arranged the cavalry near the sea, the infantry and phalanxes towards the center, the shield-bearers towards the mountain slope, and the light cavalry and archers towards the mountain ridge. Approximate estimates suggest that a Macedonian army of 40,000 faced off against a Persian army of 100,000 at the Battle of Issus. The Macedonian army was formed in one line, while the Persian army was formed in two lines. Darius did not want to take any chances. He even had barricades built on the Pius River. Alexander, on the other hand, kept approaching the Pius River with small steps. The two armies were so close that only 500 meters separated them. There was not much time left for the battle. All the soldiers were praying to survive the fierce battle that was coming. As the Macedonian army came closer, the distance was reduced to 250 meters. They were now within range of the Persian archers, and the Battle of Issus, one of the greatest battles in history, had truly begun. The Persian archers started a barrage of arrows as the Macedonian army came into range. Macedonian soldiers raised their armor to hide from the rain of arrows. The sound of the arrows hitting and even piercing the bronze shields was deafening. Add to this the war cries from both sides, and it was a hellish scene. The Macedonians began to suffer serious losses in the first minutes of the battle. The commanders were making great efforts to keep the troops together. As the Macedonians went on the offensive and attacked the Persian ranks, the Persians increased their arrow accuracy and the casualties increased. As the Macedonian troops drew closer, the Persian archers were forced to retreat, and the infantry took their place. The Macedonian army was trying to cross the Pius River. This was made more difficult by the fact that the river was covered with jagged stones, and the soil became muddy as they walked around it. This allowed the phalanx formation to break down, and the Persians to attack where the formation broke down. But Macedonian pikes were much longer than enemy pikes, which gave them an advantage. Darius brought forward Greek mercenaries, who were more skilled in battle, but they struggled to reach behind the Macedonian pikes. It was literally hand-to-hand combat. Both sides piled on top of each other, the weakest falling to the ground and blood flowing everywhere. After a while, the Greek troops managed to break through the Macedonian phalanx. They dived through the breach and began to attack from the flanks. Things were not going well for the Macedonians. Meanwhile, the cavalry of both sides had already begun to clash on the seashore. The outnumbered Persian cavalry was gaining the upper hand, driving the Macedonian cavalry back across the Pian River. It was only a matter of time before they broke through on the right flank and closed in behind the Macedonian phalanx. It was only later, when the Persian archers lost the ability to shoot and retreated completely, that the tide of battle began to turn. Alexander and his army, able to go on a full charge, began to march on the Persians. As the Persian archers retreated, the Macedonian cavalry drove through the gaps in the enemy ranks. The cavalrymen, riding very fast horses, crushed the enemy soldiers one by one. Infantry with heavy shields pressed behind them. Suddenly, the Persian infantry and archers began to scatter, either trampled under the horses' feet or felled by sword blows. The Persian infantry, equipped with much lighter armor, were unable to resist the heavily armored Macedonian infantry. As the Persian army in the Persian second line pressed forward, the Persian soldiers caught in the middle were trapped and pushed forward on the corpses that lay on the ground. The Macedonians easily killed these soldiers caught in the middle. It was as if a low wall of Persian corpses was being built in front of them. The Persian troops in the rear could not understand what was happening and continued to push their friends forward. Alexander, however, was able to get the right and left flanks to charge and give the phalanx in the center a breather. During these battles, Alexander was wounded by a sword blow to his upper leg. King Darius of Persia was now at the heart of the battle. The horses of the chariot carried King Darius to the center of the battle. There was a moment when Alexander and Darius locked eyes. Alexander was trying to reach Darius, but his brother and his soldiers, who wanted to protect Darius, were in the way. Darius decided to leave the battle because he was uneasy and did not want his death to jeopardize the empire. Seeing Darius leaving the battlefield, his soldiers began to retreat. In fact, his cavalry fled so fast that they were crushing their own comrades to death as they retreated. It was now a chase on the battlefield. This chase continued until the sun went down. The battle lasted about 2 hours, and about 20,000 Persian soldiers were killed in the battle, most of them during their retreat. The casualties in Alexander's army were around 5,000. When the Persian kings went to war, as was customary, they would take their retinue of servants with them. Even in the campsite, palace wealth, pomp, and service were not lacking. When Darius fled, he had to leave his camp of servants behind. The Persian encampment became a source of booty and hostages for the Macedonians. Hungry for hours, the Macedonian soldiers ate their fill at tables where even bird's milk was not lacking, enjoyed the legendary Persian palace comforts, and filled their pockets with booty. Darius's tents were left as Alexander's personal trophy, and he had a good shower in Darius' bath. Among those Darius left behind were his mother, his wife Tyre, and his daughters. This was embarrassing for Darius, but Alexander assured Darius's family that they could live as they had lived in the Persian court, and that none of them would be harmed. In fact, they were treated with due respect by everyone, not treated as slaves, and never humiliated. Alexander had indeed acted nobly. It was even rumored that Alexander had an affair with Queen Tyre, and that the child born during her childbirth, which led to her death 2 years later, belonged to Alexander. Sometime later, Darius sent a letter to Alexander in order to secure a diplomatic agreement. He offered to be an ally on equal terms and to pay an unprecedented ransom for his mother, wife, daughters, and other court nobles. Alexander sent a furious counter-letter, blasting the Persians. He recalled the Persian invasion 150 years earlier and claimed that the Persians had played a role in his father's death. He argued that he was now king of Asia. After the Battle of Issus, towards the end of 333 BC, Alexander began a new march to conquer the Levant, where the Phoenicians had lived for a long time. There were 4 important cities in this region. These were respectively Aradus, today called Arvad, built on a small island; Byblos, which is still known by the same name and is a port city; Sidon, another harbor city, is known today as Saida; and finally, the city we know as Tyre, which was also known as Tyros at the time. It was also an island during the reign of Alexander the Great, and then it was connected to the mainland by filling the sea with land and became a peninsula. As Alexander continued his advance on the Levant, the cities of Aradus, Byblos, and Sidon surrendered to Alexander without a fight. The last city to be taken was Tyre. The crown prince of Tyre welcomed Alexander with a golden crown on his head and announced that he would surrender the island. Alexander then informed him that he wanted to sacrifice to the god Heracles in the temple of Melkart on the island. An oracle had told Alexander about the sacrifice. However, according to the Phoenician people living in the city, only the descendants of their own kings could sacrifice in this temple. Since Alexander was a foreigner, even if he was a king, sacrificing in the temple of Melkart would be disrespectful to the gods. So they showed Alexander a second old temple and told him he could sacrifice there. But Alexander insisted on the temple of Melkart. When his request was again rejected, Alexander said that his sovereignty had been disobeyed and that he would lay siege to the city and reclaim the island with his own labor. He would then have full claim to the city and the temple. But the island was not so easy to encircle. It was 750 meters from the mainland. In the first days of 332 BC, Alexander gave the order to build an enormous breakwater on the sea to reach the island. This would allow him to reach the island and take the city. But since building a breakwater was a very laborious task in those days, the siege lasted for months. The long siege also gave the Persians the opportunity to gather a new army. For the construction of the breakwater, Alexander raised the old city of Tyre further south. He had tens of thousands of people carry the rubble to the sea, where he began to build a 60-meter-wide breakwater. When the people of Tyre saw how fast the breakwater was being built, they sent women, children, and old people from the island to Carthage. 2/3 of the breakwater was completed quickly. However, the winds, the depth of the sea up to 5 meters, and the range of the archers on the walls of Tyre slowed down the construction considerably. The Macedonians were being wounded by the archer shots and trying to save their lives. Alexander stayed on top of the work, encouraging his men and rewarding those who worked well with money. He also built 2 siege towers at the end of the breakwater to get rid of the archer fire. The breakwater was nearing completion, but by late spring there was a shortage of both water and supplies. All supplies had to be brought in from many kilometers away. Also, since only one breakwater had been built, the Tyrians' defensive line was no more than 100 meters long. This made things difficult. Alexander brought warships from neighboring cities and Cyprus to find additional solutions to the siege. In total, a fleet of 224 ships was formed. The Tyrians, on the other hand, had a fleet of 80 ships. For this reason, they lost their dominance at sea. Thanks to the ships, the island was besieged from both north and south. Thus, the people of the island could no longer access food and started to struggle with hunger. In addition, ships with catapults and siege towers docked in the southwest of the island. One ship even had a battering ram on board to breach the walls. The Tyrians, under increasing pressure, were trapped inside the island. When the breakwater was completed, Alexander gave the order to attack from all sides. Fleets of ships began to attack from the north and south. The ship carrying the battering ram managed to breach the walls. Macedonian soldiers first entered the city from here. Apart from raining arrows, the people of Tyre threw stones, hot sand, and whatever they could find at the Macedonian soldiers. The battle soon spread to the whole city. After 7 months of siege, the city of Tyre was captured by Alexander. 6,000 Tyrians lost their lives in this battle against 400 Macedonian soldiers. In fact, only those who took refuge in the temple were spared, and the lives of 2,000 Tyrians taken prisoner were ended. Although Alexander spent months building a breakwater for the siege of Tyre, the island was actually conquered by the navy. In addition, the sacrifice in the name of the god Heracles in the temple of Melkart, which had been the cause of the war, was also performed this time after the war was won. After the conquest of Tyre, the Mediterranean Sea, like the Aegean Sea, was now under Alexander's control. Persia's dominance in the seas was completely over. The Persian king Darius sent a new proposal to Alexander. According to this proposal, the Red River in the west would be left to the Macedonians. According to General Parmenion, this was a reasonable offer, because he did not think that the Macedonians had the power to rule and hold all these lands, even if they conquered Persia. Too much territory meant too many problems. For this reason, he turned to Alexander and said, "If I were Alexander, I would accept this offer." It is known that Alexander said, "If I were Parmenion, I would accept it too." He also wrote a letter to Darius, replying that the earth cannot withstand two suns, and Asia cannot withstand two kings. In addition, Alexander had already crossed Anatolia and managed to conquer the Levant. Moreover, this weakness of the Persians made it easier for Alexander to set a new target. His new target was the satrapy of Egypt. There were several reasons why he wanted to take Egypt. The first was that the Greeks would benefit from the crops grown there. If Egypt was captured, the Greek people's ambitions to revolt would be completely ended. In addition, Egypt's extraordinary splendor made it a tourist paradise. Thus, Alexander would be able to take advantage of all the opportunities of Egypt and deprive the Persians of these opportunities. The biggest obstacle Alexander faced on his way to Egypt was Gaza, where the Persian garrison was located. Gaza was located on a hilly terrain on the desert coast. The wheels of the chariots, towers, and catapults were constantly getting stuck in the desert, making the siege of the city difficult. Another problem was the scarcity of water. Despite all these problems, Alexander successfully besieged and captured Gaza. After the capture of Gaza, Alexander requested the support of Jerusalem and asked for the city to come under his command. At first, the Jews refused, saying that they had sworn allegiance to Darius, but Alexander's arrival in Jerusalem with his army intimidated them, and the king's request was granted. Alexander gave the good news that the Jews could live as they had lived in Persia. Thus, both Gaza and Jerusalem were now under Alexander's control, and the entire Levant was conquered. Alexander the Great would then first conquer Egypt, and then face Darius again at Gaugamela for the last great battle, and then he would bring an end to Persia.